No culture in human history has ever been found without some form of God or spirit. Not one. That's not a matter of faith. It's one of the strangest facts in all of science. Think about what that actually means. Archaeologists and anthropologists have cataloged over 10,000 distinct religious traditions across human history. Civilizations that never met, never traded, never sent a single messenger across the ocean, and every single one of them looked up at the sky or down into the dark and decided something was there, watching, listening, wanting something from them. The Piraha people of the Amazon lived in almost complete isolation from the outside world for centuries. No missionaries, no traders, no borrowed mythology. And they still had spirits, still had rituals, still had an invisible world running parallel to the visible one. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern so consistent it starts to feel less like culture and more like biology. Here's the assumption most people carry around. Religion spread. One group figured it out, passed it to the next, and eventually it covered the earth like a rumor. Neat? Logical? Wrong. The isolation cases alone dismantle that. You can't borrow a belief from someone you've never met. These weren't copies of each other. They were independent inventions, arriving at the same answer from completely different starting points. Which, honestly, is the part that should stop you cold. Because if thousands of separate human groups, separated by oceans, by deserts, by tens of thousands of years, all independently decided that invisible beings exist and that those beings care about what you do, then the question isn't really about any one religion anymore. The question is about the brain that keeps producing them. All of them. Everywhere. Without exception. Something in us builds gods. The question is why. So here's the part where a cognitive scientist named Justin Barrett comes in and ruins your sense of free will a little. Barrett, working out of Oxford in the early 2000s, was trying to figure out why supernatural thinking shows up everywhere, across every culture, every era, every level of technological development. And what he landed on wasn't theology, it was engineering. Specifically, the engineering of the human brain under survival pressure. He called it the hypersensitive agency detection device, which is a mouthful, so let's just call it what it is. Your brain's paranoia system. Here's the setup. You're in sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago. It's dark, properly dark, no ambient light, no moon tonight. You hear something move in the grass to your left. A rustle. One rustle. Now your brain has two options. Option 1, assume it's the wind, stay put, relax. Option 2, assume it's a predator, spike with adrenaline, get ready to run. If you pick option 1 and it's actually a lion, you're dead. If you pick option 2 and it's actually the wind, you've lost about 30 seconds of sleep. The cost of being wrong in each direction is so wildly different that evolution didn't even hesitate. It built a brain that always assumes the rustle has a cause, a living cause, something with intent. That's not irrationality. That's the only logical design given the stakes. Barrett's insight was that this system doesn't have an off switch. It's not like your brain runs the predator check and then politely stands down when you're safe. It runs constantly. It fires on shadows, on creaking houses, on the feeling of being watched in an empty room. The system is calibrated so far toward false positives that it finds agency, intention, presence, will in things that have none. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This was the right call. The ancestors who were jumpy, who heard voices in the wind, who felt watched by the dark. They survived. The relaxed ones, the ones whose brains waited for more evidence before sounding the alarm, largely didn't make it to the part of the story where they had children. So you are, by direct inheritance, descended from the paranoid ones. Every single person watching this is the product of 100,000 years of successful overreaction. The brain Barrett describes isn't broken. It's a finely tuned machine that kept your entire lineage alive long enough to produce you. The small problem, and it is a small problem that eventually built every religion on Earth, is what happens when that machine misfires. Tonight, at some point, your house will make a noise, a creak, a settle, a sound with no obvious source. And for just a fraction of a second, before the rational part of your brain catches up, some older part of you will wonder if something is there. That's not anxiety. That's not imagination running loose. That's the misfire. Pascal Boyer, an anthropologist at Washington University in St. Louis, spent years trying to figure out why supernatural beings are so consistent across cultures. Why ghosts, spirits, and gods tend to have the same basic shape regardless of where or when they appear. What he found was almost annoyingly elegant. Supernatural beings, he argued, are what he called minimally counterintuitive. They break just enough rules to be unforgettable, but not so many that the brain can't process them. A rock that thinks, a dead person who can still see you, a being with no body that nonetheless has opinions about what you had for breakfast. Each of those ideas takes one normal category, object, person, presence, and swaps out exactly one feature. Just one. And that single swap is enough to make the concept stick in memory like a burr, passing from person to person, generation to generation, with almost no effort. Boyer tested this. Beings described as minimally counterintuitive were recalled and retold more accurately than either purely normal beings or wildly bizarre ones. The sweet spot, slightly wrong, is what survives. Which means the gods that lasted weren't necessarily the most logical or the most beautiful. They were the most memorable. Evolution of a completely different kind. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Anyway, now layer Barrett's agency detector on top of Boyer's memory research and something clicks into place. Your brain is already primed to find intention in ambiguous signals. And when it does find something, a presence, a watcher, a cause behind the rustle, the concept it reaches for is going to be one that's just strange enough to feel real. Not a wind, not a lion, something in between. Something that has will but no body, knowledge but no face. You've heard your name called in an empty room, maybe once, maybe more. You turned around. Nothing. And for a half second, your brain had already started building a story. Who was it? What did they want? Are they still here? The story collapsed when nothing appeared. But for your ancestors, in the dark, with the stakes genuinely mortal, the story didn't always get to collapse. Sometimes it calcified, and they passed it on. Every other animal on Earth lives without knowing it will die. That's not a poetic observation. It's a measurable cognitive fact, and it changes everything. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, show distress when a group member dies. They'll carry a dead infant for days. They'll go quiet. But the research, including long-term field studies by primatologist Frans de Waal, consistently shows they don't appear to anticipate their own deaths, don't modify their long-term behavior in response to that knowledge, don't lie awake running the math. The awareness seems to stop at grief. It doesn't extend to prophecy. Somewhere in human evolution, that line got crossed. We don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly how, but at some point, a human brain became complex enough to do something no other brain had done. Look forward in time, see the end of its own story, and understand that the end was coming regardless of anything it did. Sit with that for a second. Not death as an abstract concept, death as a personal appointment. Yours. Confirmed. No exceptions. The oldest known deliberate human burial with grave goods, flowers, ochre, objects placed with intention, comes from Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq, roughly 60,000 years ago. Someone died, and the people around them did not just leave, they arranged things. They put something in the ground with the body that had no practical use for a corpse, which means they were thinking about where that person was going, which means they believed on some level that the person was going somewhere. That's the moment. Not the first God exactly, but the first evidence of a mind trying to negotiate with mortality. Ernest Becker won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for a book called The Denial of Death, in which he argued that virtually all of human culture, art, religion, ambition, legacy, is downstream of this one unbearable awareness. We know we die. We cannot stop knowing it. So we build systems, stories, and gods that make the dying mean something, or at least make it survivable to think about on a Tuesday afternoon. The gods didn't come from wonder alone. They came from terror, from a brain sophisticated enough to see the cliff edge clearly and desperate enough to imagine a bridge. In Shanidar Cave, the flowers have long since turned to pollen traces in the soil, identifiable only under a microscope. But the gesture, the reaching towards something beyond the body, beyond the end, that gesture is still here. It never really stopped. Fear gets gods started, but fear alone doesn't build a city. At some point in human prehistory, groups stopped being small bands of relatives who trusted each other because they knew each other and started becoming something larger, collections of strangers who had to cooperate anyway. Farming settlements, trading posts, proto-cities with hundreds, then thousands of people who'd never shared a meal, never tracked game together, never owed each other anything personal. This is where the whole project should have collapsed, and mostly across the animal kingdom, it does. Cooperation at scale requires trust. Trust requires either direct relationship or enforcement. You can't personally vouch for 300 strangers, unless something is watching all of them, all the time, even when you're not. Ara Norenzayan, a psychologist at the University of British Columbia, called this the big gods hypothesis, and it's one of those ideas that sounds almost too clean until you look at the evidence. His argument? The spread of belief in moralistic, all-knowing gods, gods who care specifically about how you treat other people, not just whether you perform the right ritual, directly enabled large-scale human cooperation. A god who sees everything you do, including the things you do when no one else is around, is the most cost-effective enforcement mechanism ever devised. No police force required, no court, just the unshakable sense that someone already knows. Norenzayan's team ran experiments at UBC where participants played economic trust games, the kind where you can quietly cheat and pocket more money with zero consequences. When researchers subtly primed participants with God-related concepts beforehand, cheating dropped significantly. The invisible watcher changed behavior in a measurable, reproducible way. And the participants weren't performing for anyone. They were alone. Think about what that scales to. A farmer in ancient Mesopotamia who believes the gods see his weights and measures is more likely to trade honestly with a stranger from 3 villages away. That stranger trades honestly back. Supply chains form. Specialization happens. Cities become possible. Not because humans suddenly became more virtuous, but because the architecture of belief made trustworthy behavior the rational choice even in private. This is the part I find almost uncomfortably elegant. The gods that outlasted all the others weren't necessarily the most dramatic or the most ancient. They were the ones that made their believers easier to live next to. Cooperative societies outcompeted less cooperative ones, and the beliefs that enabled cooperation came along for the ride. A god who watches you cheat on your grain measurements is also, it turns out, a load-bearing wall in the structure of civilization. The theology and the city grew up together, each one making the other possible. Now forget everything you picture when you hear the word worship. The candles, the hymns, the sense of being held by something loving and vast. That's a very recent development in a very long story. The gods that came first were not warm. They were not forgiving. They were not particularly interested in your inner life or your personal growth. They were powerful, unpredictable, and needed to be managed. Göbekli Tepe sits in the hills of southeastern Turkey, and it is the oldest known temple complex on Earth. Carved stone pillars arranged in rings, decorated with animals, built by hunter-gatherers roughly 11,600 years ago. Before the wheel, before writing, before agriculture, which means before permanent settlement, before surplus food, before any of the things we usually assume are required before you can build something monumental. They built the temple first. Then, apparently, everything else followed. We don't know exactly what happened inside those rings of stone. The honest answer is, we probably never will. But the scale of the construction, pillars up to 6 meters tall, weighing up to 10 tons each, shaped without metal tools, tells you one thing clearly. Whatever these people believed, they believed it badly enough to organize enormous collective labor around it. That doesn't happen for a god you feel warmly about. That happens for a god you're genuinely afraid of disappointing. The Mesopotamian gods that came a few thousand years later were even less subtle about this relationship. Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind and storms, didn't flood the earth because humanity had sinned. He flooded it because humanity had gotten too loud and was keeping him awake. That's the actual text. The gods of the ancient world operated less like divine parents and more like extremely powerful neighbors with noise complaints and no patience. You didn't worship them out of love. You worshipped them the way you'd manage a volatile landlord. Offerings, rituals, specific words said in specific orders, because the consequences of getting it wrong were catastrophic, and the gods themselves offered no guarantee that getting it right would help. This reframes something quietly significant about the whole story. The emotional warmth we often associate with religious belief, the comfort, the sense of being known and loved by something greater, that's not where religion started. It's where religion arrived, after thousands of years of negotiation between terrified humans and the beings their brains had built to explain a world that didn't explain itself. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are still there, half buried in the hillside, facing directions nobody alive today fully understands. 11,600 years of silence, and we still can't read the room. None of this is past tense. That's the part that keeps getting me. The wiring that built the first gods, the agency detector firing in the dark, the minimally counterintuitive being that sticks in memory, the brain reaching for a story that makes death survivable. That wiring is in you, right now, today, running the same subroutines it ran 60,000 years ago in a cave in northern Iraq. A 2021 study out of the University of Helsinki tested self-described atheists under conditions of stress and uncertainty. Not mild discomfort, genuine psychological pressure, the kind that activates the older, faster systems in the brain. And what they found was that measurable supernatural thinking spiked. Not belief exactly, but the cognitive signature of it, the sense of presence, the feeling that events had meaning directed at them personally. The ancient system, coming back online. You've felt it. The moment after someone you loved died, when a song came on the radio that was somehow exactly right, and for just a second the coincidence felt too precise to be random. That's not weakness. That's not irrationality. That's a brain doing what 100,000 years of selection pressure built it to do. Find the pattern, find the agent, find the meaning. Because the alternative, in the environment where that brain was forged, was to be the one who didn't notice the lion. The system doesn't know you're safe now. It doesn't get that memo. So here's where this lands, and I want to say it carefully because it matters. Understanding where belief comes from doesn't diminish it. If anything, it makes it stranger and more worth sitting with. The fact that every human culture independently reached towards something beyond the visible world isn't evidence of mass delusion. It's evidence of a species with a particular kind of mind, one that cannot help but find meaning, cannot help but populate the darkness with presence, cannot help but ask what comes next. No culture in human history has ever been found without some form of God or spirit. Not one. You heard that at the start, but now you know what it's actually saying. It's not a statement about the supernatural. It's a statement about us, about what kind of animal builds temples before it builds granaries, buries its dead with flowers, hears its name in an empty room, and turns around. Tonight, when your house makes a noise and something old in you goes briefly, quietly alert, that's the whole story. Right there. 60,000 years of human need, still running, in the dark, in you. What do you think that means? I'd genuinely love to know. Leave it in the comments, and if this kind of rabbit hole is your thing, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.